Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today and to talk about mastering grants, aligning your strategy, calendar, and team for winning grant results. My name is Maggie Perry. I have been a grant professional for 15 years now. Been a grant professional certified since 2019. I am currently work with D.H. Leonard Consulting, and prior to that, I was a grant manager for municipal government. So I bring some experience about working with different teams, all types of teams that I'm going to use to talk about today. I have a degree in history, so that translates quite nicely with my love of research and writing. So what we're going to talk about today is we're really going to think about how to build a culture of grant seeking at your organization. And what this means is that when I talk about a culture of grant seeking, I'm really thinking of an organizational mindset. It's a shared understanding that leads to sustainable and successful grant activity. It's about embedding grant readiness and collaboration and accountability into the organization's overall operation. So how to build that culture of grant seeking, we're going to talk about thinking how to form a grant team, who should be on the grant team, how to facilitate that grant team so that everyone's engaged in your grant efforts. So before we get started, I thought I'd get to know everyone a little bit, and I have an introductory question. What are you most excited about in the next month? I have to say, before we even get to the next month, right? I'm pretty excited about tomorrow, not only because it's the GPA conference, but also because it's Halloween and I have two little ones, so we'll be going out trick-or-treating and doing all the things as long as the weather stays dry. But how about everybody else? What do we have coming up that is exciting and that you're looking forward to? Might be something as simple as the weekend, right? Or of course, we have another major holiday coming up in the next month, and that's another exciting thing to look forward to as well. Halloween with your sweet kids. Fantastic. I have to say, I'm looking forward to trick-or-treating because my kids are actually pretty picky and I get to eat most of the candy. So I am looking forward to that. So our goal for today is really, like I said, to think about how to create this grant-seeking culture in your organization and how you can create a strategy that allows you to be proactive in your grant-seeking efforts instead of the stressful process of being reactive to it. So that's and one of the key things I think we want to take away from today is looking at your organization from a top-down approach and making sure that everyone's on the same page when it comes to grants, grant seeking, grant funding, grant management, and that there is transparency and collaboration amongst your colleagues and leadership in terms of what your grant seeking efforts look like. So we're going to start by talking about a grant team. Now, what is a grant team? So a grant team is really, it's a group of colleagues, and the group of colleagues who have a stake in implementing the grant funding, managing the grant funding, implementing the program that you're using the grant funding for. So there's different ways to look at a grant team. You can look at, your program staff, those who are doing the hands-on work. That's one way to look at a grant team. And there's also leadership and kind of the strategic big picture grant team as well. And depending on your organization and the size of your organization, they could be one and the same, or they might be broken out between different types of meetings and different types of team expectations. I also wanted to share that I do have a colleague with me today, thankfully. We'll be sharing some resources and tools in the chat, some links that you can click on to get more information and to help with our discussion today. So the key piece to the grant team, to have a successful grant team, is that they are engaged. And that is one of the challenges, right, of getting all different people from the organization engaged into your grant seeking strategy. So we're going to give some tips to do that, but it's really about making sure that there's buy-in and that there is engagement from people throughout the organization. So let's think about how to form the grant team. So step one is you want to think about who should be involved. Okay, so you want to think about strategic grant team leadership. Do you need specific meetings with them and separate meetings for your program staff, the people you're doing ongoing support with? When I worked in municipal government, we had a strategic big team meeting with like leadership every quarter. But then when we talked about the specific grants and the actions we were taking on them, I would just meet with those departments on a monthly basis. And there's no right or wrong as to when you're meeting or how often you're meeting. It really, as long as there's clarity of expectations around when that's going to be, and those who you want to be involved are aware of it, and you know what the cadence of those meetings is going to be, you can kind of right size it to your organization depending on how big or small your grant calendar is and how many of those meetings you need to have. Like I said, in terms of thinking strategically about like big picture priorities for the next year and making sure there's alignment from the leadership all the way down, you want to meet at least a few times a year to make sure that those priorities aren't changing, that everyone's on the same page. And then with the program staff, I'd say a little bit more regularly, especially if there's some programs that are getting a lot more grants than others, to make sure that everybody's up to date on when feedback's needed and what kind of input that you need for them. So it's not about there's a right or wrong answer to how often you're meeting. It's about finding what the right fit for your organization is. So in thinking about who to engage, so who is already kind of involved in the grant process, the people kind of get grants, if you know what I mean. There are some that don't get grants and there are some that do. So start with talking to the individuals who are really active in providing feedback on grant applications, giving you the data on the grant reports that you need, the people that you already are working with. Those you certainly want as part of your overall larger grant team. One key that I can't stress enough is that you want to have budget people there. So whether you're a larger organization and you have a finance office, or maybe you're a small organization and it's really your program staff who are putting out the budgets for the different programs, or maybe your executive director is, whoever's putting together your budgets, you want them involved regularly with the grant team, because as we know, the budget piece is so important and really guides everything that we're doing in the grant and the things that are needed, that it's important to have them involved really from early on in the process. Another person is leadership. So I know everyone, calendar, we call it the calendar Jenga. Sometimes it's hard to find the space for the things. So that's why setting up kind of our cadence, understanding, okay, over the next year, we're going to meet once a month, every third Tuesday, and get it on the calendars early so you can grab that time. Because when you're trying to set it up, week to week or month to month, it can be hard to prioritize that. So that's why I kind of set that expectation of when you're going to meet so you can get on people's calendars so you can get, your leadership positions there, maybe even someone from the board, not even just your CEO. If you're reporting out to the board on your grant activities, consider inviting them to your strategy meetings. So that way they can ask questions and it will go a lot smoother when it comes time for those board meetings when, you have to produce those reports. So thinking about, yes, your program staff, right? But also budget and leadership individuals as well. Think of it as your dream team. Now I'll probably show my age here a little bit, but I remember like when the dream team phrase was coined back in 1992 for the basketball, the Olympic dream team. My family was a big Larry Bird fan, so that time meant a lot to us. But that's what you want to be. You want to bring people from each department who are kind of the leaders in those departments to all come and collaborate on your grant team meetings. A few that I want to highlight in here that I hadn't mentioned yet, an evaluation person. We're going to get more into the evaluation in a little bit, but who's collecting the data? Who's doing the reports? You want to have those individuals involved too, because as you're putting together your grant strategy and you're starting to actually work on applications, you want to make sure the data you're calling out is what's being collected, is things that you can actually report on. So they're another individual that's really important to be involved in the meetings early on. And who is your editor and your outside, excuse me, your outside reader? We're going to talk more about that in a little bit. And some of these can have multiple roles, but you want to be able to have someone that can take a look at your applications, take a look at your reports, give it a fresh perspective. So these are all really important roles that would make a very strong grant team. And here's an example of what the responsibilities of the different roles are required. So this is something that you can actually bring to the meeting with you. Here are the types of roles and responsibilities we're looking for. Here are the activities going to play, the information we're going to look for individuals to bring. And having a document like this that kind of, clarifies what everyone's roles and responsibilities are, helps people understand why they're needed there, what sort of information should be prepared to share, and how all of this is going to come together for a really strong grant strategy. It also, I think, adds a lot to, transparency and expectation too, when you have those roles defined. So when you're thinking back of like, okay, so who are we getting involved? Who are we going to invite to these initial meetings? You also want to think about you're trying to build this grant seeking culture in your organization. So you also have to make sure that you are working with those who are maybe a little more apprehensive to your grant seeking efforts. I know in my career, I have heard someone say, oh, just go write the grant, and thinking that it's just this easy thing to do that doesn't, involve a lot of input and a lot of collaboration. So you want to try to get those individuals engaged too, those who haven't previously been or maybe are a little apprehensive or thinks grants aren't necessarily, in their purview, but having their input can be invaluable in certain pieces. So another thing to consider is inviting those who haven't normally been part of your grant seeking efforts previously or haven't been part of that collaboration. Now, once we've identified the who's going to be involved in the grant team meetings, the next thing you want to think about is what tools you're going to use. So I wanted to ask this question: how many of us are all virtual teams, and how many are like hybrid or in person? Give me a 1 if you're virtual, and give me a 2 if you're like hybrid and in person. Curious what we have in the line. I know it's changed. Oh, a lot of 2s, a lot of 2s. Okay. Okay. Some 1s. Yeah, it's a good mix. It's a good mix. 3, all, oh, I didn't even give that option. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for sharing that, Libby. Or all in person. So that is first number 1, especially for the hybrid folks. How are we going to meet? Where are we going to meet? What's the space we're meeting in, right? And with virtual too, how do you normally meet? And it's going to follow those typical protocols. And if you are doing any sort of virtual meeting, then you want to think about what tools you're going to use. Are you a Zoom team? Are you Google Meets team? How do you connect normally, and keeping those expectations aligned? If you're doing in person, or especially if you're hybrid, are we doing, I think if you can meet in the same space, it always makes the conversation go, it kind of creates a different feel, a different vibe, I think. So I always encourage at least some of the meetings, if possible, are in person. Now I say this as I work with a primarily virtual team, but we did just have our team retreat recently where we actually all got together. We do this once a year, and we talked about a lot of big picture strategy things, and the conversation just went in such great directions that I think wouldn't have happened if we were all on Zoom. So if possible, decide on having at least some of the meetings be in person, but again, you want to make sure there's clarity around what those expectations are. And then think about what tools you use. So are you using a shared file system? Are you in Google Drive, SharePoint, Dropbox, whatever that is? You want to make sure that everyone's using the same tools. I've seen organizations where some people were in SharePoint and some people were in Google Drive, and there wasn't a lot of consistency as to how documents were shared, and it creates a headache, right? It creates your sometimes a little bit of a treasure hunt to track down the pieces that you need. So when you're thinking about who's going to be involved in your grantee meeting, and then how are you going to work together? What tools are you going to use? That's an important piece. One of the things we like to say is You want to use tools that you can get to with the fewest clicks. So for those who are primarily virtual or hybrid, or even our in-person folks, when you're all in person, most of the time now, we used to all show up with like a pen and paper, right? Or at least I did. I still love a notebook and a pen. But most of the time, people have their laptops or have some sort of device with them that they're taking notes on that they're searching through. So even if you're in person, how can you get to the information you need in the fewest clicks? I worked with an organization recently and we went into their system. They had a system set up. So we're like, yep, we'll just invite us in and we'll use your system. We were working on a large grant and they were using 22 different subfolders to sort information. It was a lot of clicking. It was a lot of searching for the pieces that you need. By the end of our time working together, we got it down to 4 folders by condensing information. But it can be frustrating. You think of the days when you had to pull out the filing cabinet and you're digging through, trying to find the right file, right? If things aren't alphabetized. It's it's kind of that concept. When you're trying to click around and trying to figure out where you can go, it can be really frustrating for team members. So in order to keep them engaged, you want to think, how can I present this information? How can I make it really available to them? The things we're going to talk about. One of the things to consider is when you're putting an agenda together, and if you're going to be talking about different documents or maybe slides, a deck, anything like that, put the link right in the agenda to those pieces so they don't have to go look through the folder to find the thing. Link it right into the agenda so that's at their fingertips. Another tool that we like to use is what we call a project digest, which is something we use when we're working on large, especially like large federal grants that are very dense, have lots of attachments, budgets, budget narratives, all the pieces. We keep it in one document, a link to each individual document in just a table. So that way you're not going searching through folders to try to find the most updated draft, where your feedback's needed. It's all right there in one document. So you want to think about the easiest ways to present your information and how it's accessible to the team members without anybody getting too frustrated into trying to search it down. Another thing to think about is in terms of what are you using to present your information? A lot of us have to do reports to a board or even grant reports, or you're reporting to your supervisor who has to report to the executive director. How are we sharing information? Making sure that that's consistent and in the same place. You want to put in a system when you're at your grantee meetings that you understand how information is going to be shared, what you're measuring to determine the best demonstration of your grant seeking efforts, not just about money in the door, but we're going to talk about this a little later, but the different types of metrics you might use to demonstrate success, and then how do you report on them? And I know there's lots of different systems out there and tools to use, and a lot of them are great. And I think it's just about clarity on where that information is stored and how you can access it. Because really, what you want to do is you want to be able to keep your team engaged. You want to be able to keep them involved and excited about providing information you needed and understand the importance of the role that they play. So you don't want it just to be a meeting where they're coming and you're talking at them and people are zoning out. You want them to play an active role in your strategy. So how can we do that? Well, there's a few ways I think that you can consider hands-on approaches with your getting your colleagues involved in your grant seeking strategy. One is to collaboratively create a grant calendar. And what we mean by a grant calendar is you lay out all your expected grant deadlines, grant reports, all the pieces that you have coming up in the next, whether you're on calendar year or you're on fiscal year, in a place that everyone can see them. And this goes back to talking about tools and how you use them. Now, when I worked in local government and we were not virtual, everybody was in person and we had a shared meeting space, we put together a grant calendar that we used. We literally used one of those old, like the desk calendars, the big desk calendars, and we hung it on the wall. And that way you can look through and see what the plan was for the year at that time. Everything was written in pencil because sometimes plans change, as this year can definitely show us. And it showed us what was happening this month, but you can always go through. And I would save, as we tore off a month, I would save those months. So the next year I had something to look back at for what our plan was previously. But it's about doing it collaboratively. And when you're thinking about a grant calendar, it's not just like, okay, so these are our hard deadlines. You want to also take into consideration what are your other commitments, because it's really going to help people determine with capacity in terms of what can we take on, when can we? If you set up a grant calendar and you have a ton of deadlines by September 30th. I picked that date 'cause I feel like there's just a bunch of deadlines, September 30th. Or often it seems to be grouped like the end of the quarter, right? There's always a lot of deadlines, or the beginning of a new quarter, things are due, reports are due, things like that. When you lay everything out into a calendar over 12 months, and then you take back and look, it's like, oh, now we can see where we have a cluster of a lot of deadlines, space where there's not so many deadlines. If you have any events that you're planning for the year, you want to add them in there as well. People time off, PTO, because that's an important part to consider and make sure we're not getting burnout. Everybody's taking their PTO, adding that as well. And when you have this clear picture of a grant calendar, you can say, here's our plan for the year. It helps you determine when new opportunities pop up, if they fit in, do they fit in with the capacity we've already committed? If we have to replace this, application A with application B based on what our priorities are. I say again, I think we all can relate to the fact that this year things have changed a lot on not only government level, but on the foundation level too. And the plan we might have laid out last year didn't exactly, flesh out the way we anticipated. So having the grant calendar, it's not about having something written in stone. It's about having something you can react to as the plan changes throughout the year. It gives you a forward-looking approach. So that is one way to really engage the colleagues, is like sit down and put that grant calendar together. And that also helps like budget understand when things are going to be needed from them, the executive director, when things are going to have to be signed off by them. And it kind of gives clarity as what the year is going to look like coming up. Another way that your colleagues can be really hands-on is to actually help support in the grant application development process. And we're going to talk about that more in a little bit. But before you even get there, I think a great way to have engagement from colleagues is by creating a logic model for your programs or a work plan. And that's an interesting way to have a collaborative session in going through, a high-level logic model for a program design, and to make sure that everyone's on the same page and everyone's feedback is incorporated. Another way is for evaluation purposes, is to have them help determine what are we measuring, how are we measuring it, is it what is important to us, are we measuring the things that we value and that's demonstrating the change we're trying to make. Having feedback on that really can be an informative conversation. And then also using your colleagues and your grant team to serve as what we call mock reviewers, which we're going to talk about more in depth in a little bit. But ultimately, that what means is that they're providing feedback on applications as they're written and taking a very hands-on approach. So these are just some ways, some actual like activities you can do with your team to have them be really engaged and to have that hands-on approach. So in thinking about your grant calendar and that annual strategy, best case scenario is that they are helping draft it, right? If that's not always possible, where you can't have a meeting where everybody sits down and puts the calendar together, make sure you're getting their feedback on it. That's something that's shared in a space where you can get their feedback, whether it's shared through your shared folder system or shared via email through a draft, whatever it is, ask them to review it and provide their feedback on it. One of the top reasons for that is because you want to make sure your calendar aligns with what your strategic priorities are for the upcoming year. Now, this will help you be proactive in terms of your grant seeking instead of reactive. And I think everyone's probably, if you've been in the grant profession for even just a little bit of time, you've probably experienced the stress of colleagues sending you, oh, I saw this opened or this RFP or this grant opened up, and can we do this? Can we do this? And sometimes it can be really overwhelming as you're trying to look at all these different things and think, well, what would we apply for and what is this for? When you have a designated grant calendar and you really understand what your priorities are, it will help you determine which things that you didn't anticipate to open that did are a fit, and it should be something that's brought into the calendar. Now, I know strategic plans, I get really excited over strategic plans, especially ones that are in use. Ironically, I was just meeting with an organization not this morning, and we were talking about strategic planning, and they're like, yeah, that we have one. It's on a shelf somewhere, right? And that's not uncommon, but even if you don't have a strategic plan you're following, or you have a really beautiful plan and it's like a 5-year plan, thinking about what are our priorities for this upcoming year. Now, if you sit down with your grant team and you ask everyone, what are the priorities? You're probably going to get different responses from executive director versus program versus budget. You're going to hear different things, and that's okay. It's about whittling down maybe 10 priorities that are going to be thrown at you to like 3 or 4 actionable ones that you can focus on the next year. And sometimes it's difficult if you don't have that priority conversation and you're starting to, as the grant professional, apply for programming and apply for projects, and everything feels like it's all equal priority and all pulling in your direction. It's not going to be a sustainable strategy and it's not going to be really successful. So ideally, your strategy for the year is tied to a strategic plan. If you don't have a strategic plan, sit down. Now, this is, again, going back to my time working in municipal government, we didn't have a strategic plan. So we sat down and we had to come up with the top 3 priorities for the year. And that helped provide a lot of clarity as opportunities opened up. And I could say, no, and maybe it's because of you're trying to grow a program. Maybe it's you're trying to implement something new. Maybe it's because something's underfunded and you need funding to help sustain it. You can't understand that unless you get input from everyone. So having a collaborative activity where you talk about strategies and you understand what the priorities are for the year is going to help you set up a really successful grant calendar and a plan that will actually have some success. So like I said, may not always work out. Ideally, best case scenario is that you are meeting and doing it collaboratively. If that's not the case, you're at least getting feedback and approval on the plan. And when this is done, when it's like, yes, this is our grant plan for the year, again, not written in stone, but at least it's giving you an outline of what to follow as opportunities open up. It helps you do something that we like to call strategic no's. And a strategic no is when you say no to an opportunity for a reason that aligns with your plan. So maybe you're eligible, maybe you could possibly fit your program into that, or you can kind of mesh it around and make it fit. But is that really the priority for the year? Is that really what you're trying to grow or sustain? And if it's not, and you look at your grant calendar and you're like, oh, and on top of that, we have 5 reports due in the same time, and we're working on a large state grant, and it's like, no, we don't have the capacity and it doesn't fit with our priorities. Because we know I had to do it myself. You're reporting to a board that's saying, well, why don't we apply to this? And why don't we apply to this? And this organization applied to this. And this gives you a way to say, because we have a plan here and we strategically said no to it because what we're doing is actually a better fit. So when I see an organization say no to something after it's been vetted, I'm like, great, you're doing the work because you know what your priorities are and you know what your need is so well that you can say no instead of just reacting to every RFP that opens and kind of chasing it, because that is a very stressful process. And one of the things I think, that we're seeing, especially on the government side and a little bit on the foundation side too, is I feel like timelines are getting shorter. I hope it's not just me. If anybody else has been feeling this too, timelines, I feel like for the grant turnaround are very short. I remember when I first got into working on federal grants, we'd have 60 days. Now it's like 30 There was one that opened this summer. I think it was 14. So reacting to opportunities that pop up like that and trying to put, a really competitive when you didn't plan for it and it wasn't part of your strategy, it would have to be a unicorn. It would have to be a perfect fit to take on the stress of turning something around so quickly. So I know, good. Thank you, Claire. It's not just me. Timelines just feel short. And I think with on the foundation side too, as they're responding to the different needs that are popping up this year, as well as I feel like it's more competitive than ever because of the lack of federal funding. It's putting pressure on the pool of foundation funding. And because of that, we're seeing a lot of changes in the structure of how that's done. So being able to not just chase every RFP that opens because you've met with your team and you've had this plan is going to create a much more sustainable process for everyone. But more than that, it'll actually make you more successful because you put a lot of time and thought into your needs, and you're going to be able to show that through your grant applications. So this is a perfect way, and I mentioned that having the collaboration on the grant calendar is so important. And my old school, example of hanging the desk calendar on the wall, there are much better visual ways to do that now, but it worked for us at the time. A whiteboard is a great tool to do it, or there are so many virtual tools too. One tool that we use is called Mural, where it's kind of like a virtual sandbox where you have this big whiteboard and you can build it out in any way you want. There are a lot of different resources that you can use to kind of have it in a way that's virtual so people can go and see it at any time. Or maybe you're like me and you have a common meeting space, and having something just up on the wall is the best way to do it. So the bottom line is you want to keep it visible to the team. And every time you're having those meetings, we talked about like big strategic planning, leadership level meetings, maybe once a quarter. You're revisiting that plan. Does this still make sense? Is this still our top priority? Again, I know I keep saying it, but like this year changed us. It brings me back to like the COVID year, like 2020, when things changed so rapidly. Pivot was the word that year, right? I think we're seeing that a lot again. So we see funders pivoting to what their priorities are going to be. And maybe, your organization had to change too in terms of priorities based on availability of funding, based on needs of those you're serving. So you want to don't just create the plan and have it and be like, okay, we're good, we're done for the year. You want to keep revisiting it. You want to keep taking a look at it and making sure it still makes sense. That's why we're writing it in pencil, because it's adaptable. It gives you a way to change it as things change. But if it's not clear and transparent for the whole team to see, then you're not going to have the buy-in and the engagement that you're hoping for. So one of the most obvious ways, now we're still talking about how to engage the team, how to keep them engaged, is to have them just participate in providing feedback on applications. But we know sometimes that can be a little bit challenging, right? You ask for feedback, and then you send the friendly reminder, and then you have to ask again, like, please, I need feedback. I need your input on this. And that's a pretty common problem. So one of the ways that, what do you do when you struggle to get the needed information? We like to use a strategy called MSU. Has anyone ever heard of MSU before? This is called making stuff up. Now, it's not as bad as it sounds. It's almost like Mad Libs for grant writing. So what this means, and this is based on Cheryl Kester's strategy, where making stuff up it's like a tool you use to get the feedback you need in a way that doesn't feel burdensome to those that you're sharing it with. So here's an example, and I use this all the time when I'm doing proposal writing. We aren't actually just making stuff up, but we're framing out the response to help them kind of just fill in the blanks. I have noticed in my time that it's so much easier to get feedback when you're asking for the individual you're sharing it with that to respond to something that's already written than just saying like, oh, could you just tell me about your objectives? Or can you just tell me what your outputs are this year? sometimes, they can't, it's not that easy to just come up with, or feels like it's really time consuming. So it's something that gets put off. When you give them information like and say, is this correct? Or can you help me just fill in this blank? It's much easier to get the feedback that you needed. I just shared a draft this morning on a state grant that I we don't have a ton of information yet. I'm still trying to get everything we need. It was just our first draft. I wrote out an entire implementation plan using MSU and just asked a lot of questions. Is this right? Is this okay to say? How does this look? And that way the person can read and be like, if they come back and say this is all wrong, I'm okay with that because it meant they're reading it and I'm getting the feedback that I need. Instead of like sometimes you ever share a draft and be like, I wonder if they actually read it. I'm not sure. But when you get the feedback like, nope, this is all wrong, or we do it this way, that's perfect because that's the feedback that you need. So when you're engaging program staff, leadership, finance, whoever it is that you need the information from. We know, especially those working in nonprofits, they're wearing a lot of hats, they have a lot on their plate. So we're trying to catch them when we can, giving them the prompt, giving them as much information ahead of time to just kind of fill in, I think is the key to getting the feedback when you need it. I think the other piece to that is having really clear and transparent timelines. And this is something you can talk about at your grant strategy meetings, right? Um, I think that ideally you're giving them a week to review it, but sometimes that's not feasible, right? It's just not when we have these really tight deadlines and we're trying to get the information that we need. So just saying right at the back, we really need this by this date. And then explaining at your, when you're meeting regularly, talk about grant timelines, talk about that loop. And anything that if it's a hard deadline, if it's a renewal, if it's a grant you're planning to submit this year, start it as early as possible. Don't wait to just a couple weeks before. I had a friend telling me she just did a big state grant in 48 hours. The organization decided to apply. It was 48 hours before the deadline that she started it. I was like, oh, Lord, I want to send you some coffee or something. I was like, that is just so stressful, right? And we don't want that to happen. We want you to think about the plan so that when you're asking people for feedback, you can give them the time to actually provide the feedback. And it doesn't feel like, oh, you have to overnight colleagues are working at 2 a.m. trying to provide you the grant details that you need. So using MSU is a great way to get the feedback you need on the really important pieces you have to have from colleagues. I just wanted to comment on Claire's comment in the chat because I thought that was really funny to sneak the song lyrics into the draft. That is clever. That is clever. So another way that we can engage our colleagues is by having them work on logic models, work plans, and budgets. Okay, so when we're thinking about, I worked with a grant professional recently and an opportunity came up and they're like, oh, but I'm not sure what to apply for. And I said, go ask your program person if they had $50,000, what they would do. I guarantee they're going to have some ideas. Or go ask your executive director. If they had an extra $50,000, how would they use it? They have an idea, right? And this is why if you're having those conversations ahead of time, when opportunities open, you know what kind of direction you're going in. So that's why having these meetings and getting everyone together and talking about what are the big picture things you want to do? What's the direction you want to go in? What are our priorities for the organization, on the larger scale? And then we as grant professionals, we take that and we can kind of put it together in a realistic way. It's like, okay, maybe we can't do all of that this year, but we might be able to do a piece of it. And that's how you kind of develop your plan. So it's mixing their dreams and the reality of what we can actually put in like deliverables and grant proposals and bringing them together and determining, okay, what's actually achievable. And that's why this engagement is really, really helpful. I think a great way to start is to think about SMART objectives. Now, I really love SMART objectives because I think that it's really difficult to write a proposal if you don't know what your objectives are. So when we're thinking about how to engage our team, even before we're doing the grant application stuff, we are thinking about what the objectives are. And this is a place where you can use MSU to get the feedback from your colleagues. Frame out what you want to see in the objectives, what the time frame is. In year one, ABC will happen, we'll serve X many of people, kind of put it together for them and get their feedback. Using SMART objectives to me is just, it sets your application up for success because it really responds to what the funders want to see. And we're actually seeing like the use of the term SMART objectives in proposals where they want to actually see you put in SMART objectives. And I've seen that in federal proposals and I've seen it in state proposals too, where they actually use the acronym. So if that's their expectation, big picture, then you want to make sure you have that language already in your wheelhouse to be able to prop into those proposals. But you're not going to be able to do that without input from the grant team and to make sure everyone has a clear understanding what your objectives are for each program. Once you know your objectives and you've kind of had that brainstorming session around them, doing a work plan is also a fantastic way to get the feedback, again, before we're working on the grant proposals. So this is about the programs we have. So our current programs, what are our objectives this year? And what is our work plan for this year? If you have these done ahead of time, it's going to set you up for success so much when you're sitting down to work on a draft. Or also when you're thinking about the large government grants, I saw briefly, I think I saw a comment fly by that said something about doing a SAMHSA grant in 48 hours. Oh my goodness, that's impressive. And to see it was funded, that's amazing. You are skilled. I'm sure that was a stressful 48 hours for you. I hope not too bad. We've turned around some quick government grants. In the times that we've done it, that was the least stressful, it's because we started with the pre-planning side and we've done work plans ahead of time. We've done some budget drafting ahead of time. So that way you kind of have these pieces ready to go and you already have approval from the grant team on them. So it gives you a really good head start on working on, especially the larger applications. But even for the smaller ones, if these are not the pieces you're asking for feedback on because you've already done that work together, it's going to really help you write a competitive application, especially if there's a tight turnaround. Now, my favorite is the logic model. I know I just said SMART objectives are my favorite, but they kind of tie together. I'd say logic model is my more favorite. I know you're not supposed to have favorites, but I do. I think every single program should have a current logic model. That's my opinion. Some might disagree with me, or ideally, yes, that would be in a perfect world, that of course that would happen. But I think if you do your logic models like annually, sit down with your program staff, have them give you updated logic models on each program, then it's going to make the writing of the applications a lot easier. So, and sometimes you have colleagues and program staff or leadership even who's like, I'm not sure what a logic model is. If you're not in the grant world, it may not be a term that they've heard. So we actually do this really cool exercise with organizations who are new to logic models, where we call it the cookie baking logic model. And we use that because we're like, okay, say our project is we're going to bake chocolate chip cookies. And we go through this process of like, if we're baking chocolate chip cookies as a team, what are our inputs? And we need an oven, we need flour, and we go through all the pieces. This allows you to kind of understand what the expectations are for a logic model and then translate that to your programs. So if you want logic models for your programs, you don't have them, and you're working with staff that aren't that familiar with them, have a fun work session. Hey, for the in-people crowd, for the people who are in person, you can say, we're going to do a little team building activity and bake cookies together. Or kind of just go through what the process is and think about, this is how we build a logic model. That'll easily translate to your programs of like, what are outcomes? What are outputs? How do we, talk about all of this for our programs? But having a logic model at your fingertips that are regularly updated and approved by leadership, and everyone is collaborative and everyone, is on the same page with it, is going to make your grant seeking efforts a lot less stressful. Plus, if you kind of take time every year, the ending of the fiscal year, let's update our logic models based on what happened this year. you're going to be asking them for less feedback in the like last minute applications than you would previously if you didn't have the logic model in place. So that's just something to consider too, because it could save a lot of feedback time and reduce stress for everyone on the team. Oh, budgets. I can say easily that budgets are my least favorite part of grant applications, although the most important. And I say that because different funders have different templates, have different expectations between what's in the budget. So it can be a bit of a stressful process putting together budgets that respond to the funder's expectations. So here we have on the screen like your typical non-construction federal budget and what that looks like. I think, like the logic models, is going through an activity where you have program budgets broken out that are updated every year is going to be really helpful. You know, you usually set up your large organizational budget, right? And that's something you have to do annually, has to be board approved or whatever your process is. The program budgets often aren't as much of a priority. And what I've seen a lot is that organizations, especially smaller ones, will be like, oh, we're going to apply for this grant, and they create a budget for the grant, and then they create a different budget for the program for a different grant, and it adds a lot of stress on the program people who are giving this information. If you have finance people who are keep having to produce these budgets, instead consider urging the organization when they're doing the large organizational budget to also break it out across program budgets. So that way, when you're working on a grant application, you can easily adapt what you already put together in your program budget into the requirements of the application. And I think that another layer you could add that was really helpful. We worked with one organization that did this, and it was so helpful. It took a little bit of work on the front end, but it really paid off on the back end. Was not only did they have program budget, but they had explanations in the program budgets about what grants are funding, what positions, how much is funding this. So, you know, if you have a program director position, it's like, okay, grant A is paying 100% of this, but grant B might be paying 50% of the next position, and kind of have it all broken out. So it's easy to see where are the gaps in funding, what positions are fully funded, which aren't, what activities still need funding, or if you're trying to grow your program, do something brand new, what that would look like too. So something to consider as you're having your strategic planning meetings, especially when you're thinking about next year's organizational budget, is to break out and do separate program budgets ahead of time. So that way you have them accessible at your fingertips when it's time to write the grant application. And another piece that's really important to have collaboration and engagement on is your evaluation pieces. We see some sort of evaluation question in almost every grant application. If you're writing a SAMHSA grant, as was shared in chat, you're writing a pretty heavy evaluation plan. Foundation grants, maybe it's just a small character counted question, but the bottom line is you want clarity and consistency around what you are counting. What are you analyzing? What data are you collecting? Because if there isn't clarity around that, it could cause a big problem if you have a program person telling a grant person, you know, we're going to report on A, B, and C, and then you have your evaluated person be like, we don't collect those pieces, or our survey doesn't have those questions. And then it's time to report, and you can't report on the things you said you were going to do in the grant. That causes, then you have to go to the funder and you have to, you know, talk to them about that. It can cause a huge tangle. So to avoid that, have clarity on what kind of things you are collecting for feedback, and have it be more than just number served, right? Number served, your outputs, that's like your hard numbers. You want to be able to show change. And there are evaluating firms that can write really fancy high level evaluation plans, which sometimes are required, especially for federal grants. But it doesn't have to be a really heavy thing. You just have to think about what is your mission? What are you trying to do? What are the changes you're trying to make? And how can we measure what's important to us? And when you do that, especially on the foundation grants, and you can show sometimes the progress, like I said, more than just number served. You want to have the quantitative and the qualitative pieces to your evaluation. But it doesn't have to be very, very, very high tech. It can be, interviews, it can be anecdotal, it can be surveys, um, focus groups, things like that. But you want to understand, you want clarity throughout the whole organization on what kind of data you're collecting, how you're doing it, and what you can really report on, because that's really important, is to have consistency across your grant applications and not get jammed up on the reporting side. Another way we talked about engagement, I mentioned earlier on, is to be a mock reviewer. Now, a mock review is a little bit different than just your standard like edit, proofread. A mock review is asking a colleague or asking, a friend to actually read the application against the rubric. Is it readable? Does it make sense? Are we responding to what's going to be evaluated? And have so someone who hasn't seen it, we call it fresh eyes, a fresh perspective, read it over. I used to have, when I was working in the municipal government, I had a colleague, she was the administrator who worked on, she did like the dictaphone. People were still using dictaphone then, and she would type up all the reports. So she was really good with like language and grammar. So I'd say, can you read these? And here's how they're going to score it. And can you please just read it? She had nothing to do with grants, nothing to do with my department, but she'd always read it for me. She really enjoyed it, and would kind of say like, oh, I don't think you're answering this, or you do answer this. And now our team uses that. This is embedded in every government grant we do. And we don't just have one mock reviewer, we have three. So we can kind of compare and contrast notes. So it's a really important process. As a writer, it's sometimes a little bit challenging because like when I'm, my stuff's going through mock review, I call it like my 7 phases of grief. Like first I get the results and I get like real mad and defensive. Then I might maybe shed like one tear, you know. And then there's like, oh no, these people are completely right. Yep, I didn't make that clear enough, right? So that's a normal process to kind of react to mock reviewing. Sometimes it can be a little awkward. Like I worked so hard on this, now you're telling me I'm missing things. But that's the important part. So having a colleague, for someone from your grant team who wasn't involved on the writing of the application, read it and score it. It helps them see what goes into it. That is a really important piece that someone can play. Now we talked about who's on the grant team, what kind of activities you can do to have a grant team. And now we're going to talk about the steps to facilitating the grant team. And some of this we've already covered, right? Who is your facilitator? That's not always necessarily the grant professional. Who can get the attention of the room, right? And it depends on your role and it depends on your organizational culture, but who are people going to listen to? Who are they going to respond to? That's really who you want to use to facilitate the grant meeting. Is the facilitator the same if you're having like big annual, your biannual or every quarter strategy grant meetings as you are when you're working on individual grants or the more regular grant meetings? That's something to consider too. Who's going to facilitate? Who is going to get everyone engaged and have people listen to them? And then you also want to consider, like we talked about, who's a part of which team. So are you going to do both? Are you going to have like your big picture strategy meetings and then the next level down, kind of like the regular, here are the grant applications we're working on, here's who gives us input meetings? Think about for your organization and what makes the most sense there. And that's how you determine, all right, who's going to be the facilitator for each. Set expectations around communications. There's nothing worse than, well, there are things worse than that, but it's always challenging when you have people responding to you or communicating with you through different ways. Maybe one person sending an email. Somebody else might be using, if you use like Slack or any sort of Google chat or something like that. Maybe somebody else is putting comments like in the agenda. You want everyone to communicate in the same way. So if you're having like your initial strategy meetings, how are we going to communicate? Are we all going to communicate through on a long email chain? Are you going to, what is your method for communicating? Again, no right or wrong, as long as everybody understands what it is and doing the same thing and you agree which tools to use. Boundaries. Boundaries are important and they're hard to set sometimes, but what you want to think about boundaries is you want to be respectful of working hours. You don't want to schedule meetings if most of the people are done at 5 o'clock at 4:30. You want to be respectful of people's time off. Don't schedule meetings when people are typically on vacation, or if someone important, part of the team's on vacation that week, move the meeting. Meeting length, you don't sit down and expect to take, 2-3 hours up to cover all these pieces. You want to be respectful of people's times and calendars. In order to keep them engaged, you have to take that into consideration. And the other thing, like I mentioned before, is timelines for input. When you're sharing drafts, when you're sharing calendars and you're asking for input, be respectful of, everyone has a lot on their plate, but also realistic into when that feedback's needed. So I think boundaries are a really important thing to keep in mind as well. And like we said before, where are you going to keep the things visible? What tools are you going to use? Is it going to be something that's for the in-person people in the office? Is it going to be a virtual tool? Make sure that that's clear and the expectations are there as to where the information can be found and what resources you are using. Reduce the number of clicks. This isn't the exact picture of what I was just working on with the 22 subfolders, but here's an example of not having people chase the breadcrumbs to try to figure out where all the files are. Make it really accessible in them. Share the direct links, have things in agendas so people don't get frustrated and you can keep them engaged. And this is probably the most important thing. Celebrate success. And success can mean all different things. Of course, when it comes to leadership and boards and things like that, one of the most important things are, how much funding do we bring in? But that's just not all that it comes down to with this success. Other things you can measure is how many new contacts have we made? How many new relationships have we had? How many new site visits with new funders are coming? Do we get all of our reports in on time? Do we submit early? Submitting early, that's big for our team because we know portals crash and weird things happen. So getting those grants in early is really important. So pausing, because we know that grant wheel, it keeps turning, right? The deadlines, they keep coming. So when it feels like it's never ending, make sure you're pausing to celebrate the small wins and the large wins. But it takes a lot to get a grant application out the door. So showing what metrics you're collecting to prove that you're successful in your overall strategy. I think another one is like, how many did we have strategic no's to? That's a way to determine success because it shows that you know what your priorities are. These are all things to consider, but just make sure that you are thinking about ways to celebrate. Our team uses this, the little dingy bell. We ring the bell when we have early submissions. We ring the bell when there's good contact with a new funder. We ring the bell for all different types of reasons. So that's something else to consider as with your team too. How can you celebrate? And we have a free download here. If you scan the QR code, it's for our research guidebook, which is a great tool to use when you're talking about prospect research and aligning with your priorities like we talked about. And if there's any questions or concerns you have or you want to bring up afterwards, or even for those of you who want a grant rant, it's a safe space, right? There's a lot to rant about when it comes to grants these days. Please feel free to reach out. This is my contact information, so you can feel free to email me at any time. As you can tell, I love to talk about all things grants. And please, please, please let us know what you think by taking this quick survey. Surveys are really important. We take them very seriously to determine what matters and how we can best support as we continue to use these platforms. So thank you, everyone, for being here. This is a huge honor for me. It's my first time presenting at GPA, so I hope I did all right. But please follow up with any questions or concerns, or even just to chat.